what the great world reveals in its temporal flow corresponds to a pendulum swing in our being that does not move in the element of time. Our sensory and perceptual being, we feel, corresponds much more to the nature of summer, woven through with light and warmth. During winter's existence, we sense ourselves much more grounded in ourselves and living in our own thought and will worlds. Thus, the rhythm of inner and outer becomes for us what in nature, in its temporal alternation, presents as summer and winter. A great mystery of existence can rise if we bring our timeless rhythms of perception and thought into correspondence with nature's temporal rhythms. If we do so, the year becomes the archetype of human soul activity, and thus becomes a fruitful source of true self-knowledge. This pendulum swing that does not move in the element of time refers to a structure of our consciousness that has been eclipsed over the last 500 years. Steiner's words, in reference to the calendar of the soul, speak of the potential to consciously participate in this pendulum swing, this rhythmic movement of our being that connects us with the larger rhythm of the cosmos. We are better equipped to strive for this if we can get to know what human experience was like in the past. How did our ancestors relate to the world around them? As Owen Barfield put it, before the scientific revolution, the world was more like a garment men wore about them than a stage on which they moved. Unlike the three-dimensional world of manipulable objects that most of us experience today, our ancestors were embedded in a world they wore like a living fabric. This entailed being subject to other agencies, vulnerable to other agencies, who were also incorporated in the world fabric. So agencies like something as benign as a mischievous nature spirit, potentially benign, something as beneficent as an angel, or something as harmful as a demon. So following Charles Taylor, we could characterize our ancestors as having had a porous self, a porous subjectivity, whereas today we tend to experience ourselves as buffered from the outside world, which comes with some blessings. For example, not being as vulnerable to demonic possession. In a similar vein as Barfield, Taylor, and Steiner, Jean Gebser spoke of a mythic structure of consciousness and traced its emergence in the artifacts of art history. Of the Prince of the Lilies, a Minoan fresco created over 3,000 years ago in the palace of Knossos on the Greek island of Crete, Gebser writes, "It expresses man's extrication from his intertwining with nature in two ways. First, by presenting terrestrial man, and not a divinity, standing out in partial relief from the background, which surrounds and protects him, and thereby depicting the body in partial extrication from his surroundings. And second, by placing the upper torso against the sky. The sky is simultaneous with the soul, and we would also add simultaneous with time. The upper torso is free, as it were, and only the actual vegetative vital region of the body, from the waist to the feet, is surrounded by nature. And even this is no longer an enmeshment, for the nature surrounding him is a nature already illuminated." So Gebser here is tracing the emergence or the differentiation of human consciousness from the sort of primordial ocean of meaning of the world soul. So primordial wholeness steps down into the dyad of psyche and cosmos. But the ancients did not conceive number abstractly, and so two was already undergirded by wholeness. And the relation that unites the two of two is the number 3. Polarity is this threefold dynamic, and it weaves through everything in the world. As Gebser writes, "With the advent of polarity came the phenomenon of complementarity, day and night, brightness and darkness, heaven and earth, pillar and cavern." In contrast with today's prevailing linear experience of time, where we have past, present, and future, the paradigm of time for this older mythic structure of consciousness, which is still with us today, was polarity. Gebser calls this form of time temporicity. This temporicity is based on movement or kinesis. It is a form of movement that leads from one phase of the moon to another, from new moon to new moon, 9 moons to 9 moons, birth to death, spring to winter, from the tides of the earth to the tides of the body which blossom forth, bear fruit, and attain completion, just as the year unfolds, bears fruit, and completes its cycle, like the stars which ascend, reach their zenith, and descend. In this cosmos itself forms a circle, rotating and drawing the energy for its rotation from the polarity. So with this example that Gebser offers of the Prince of the Lilies, which he takes to be a kind of fossil of the emerging mythic structure of consciousness, he lays emphasis on its founding through the polarization of the psyche or the soul and the world or the cosmos, and specifically in relation to the sky. So the soul or the psyche finds its reflection in the periodicities of the sky. In contrast to the more abstract, almost intangible character of time that we tend to experience today, the temporicity of our ancestors reflected their deep participation in the life of the cosmos, in this pendulum swing of polarity that wove itself through everything from the lunar cycle to the plant cycle to the course of the stars throughout the day. And we also hear Gebser insisting on the spacelessness of the mythic structure, which echoes Barfield's earlier characterization of the relationship to the world for human beings prior to the scientific revolution, as if it were a garment that they wore. This is perhaps hard for those of us living today to imagine, because our world is so defined by the emergence of perspective in the Renaissance and its technological deployment with the scientific revolution, which today, we might recognize in the ubiquity of screen technology, which situates the viewer in such a way that we become sharply aware of depth and the relationship of objects to each other in space, which promotes a kind of disengaged, objectifying gaze. So this spacelessness of the mythic structure of consciousness conveys a much more participatory mode of relationship to the world as a garment that we wear, the world that is continuous with my own body and my own mind, the porous self that Charles Taylor referred to. Whereas today, we, with our very spatialized experience, have more of a buffered self, set apart from the world with our objectifying gaze. The calendar of the soul is a means for renewing our participation in the life of the cosmos, but perhaps with more of a buffer and an individuated self, which isn't such a bad thing. But before making any more comparisons between this mythic structure of consciousness, which is still with us today, and this mental structure of consciousness, which Gebser says predominates in our time, let's continue deepening into the emergence of the mythic structure. When speaking of the temporicity of the mythical structure, we must not lose sight of its residual spacelessness. In the undifferentiated brightness and darkness, man begins to discern forces which slowly disengage themselves from movement and become animated primal images. These primal images are reflections of the inner dark and unfathomable forces in man, which we call the powers of the soul or psyche. The initial dimly lit consciousness is pervaded by darkness. Only with the gradual increase of conscious intensity is there a proportional illumination of those powers represented as movement. This process takes place on a surface which is spaceless, or at least remote from space, like the night, with its dark, two-dimensional planiform ground devoid of spatial depth. So again, there's this insistence from Gebser on the spacelessness of the mythic structure and the sort of planiform or surface character of the world, and the soul's gradual emergence, extrication from the dark, chthonic, cosmic night of the primordial ocean of meaning. And so in this world torrent, this dynamic of differentiating out of the cosmic night, this ocean of meaning, Gebser describes a kind of condensation of the forces into primal images, which beget the first myths. A prime example being the Greek myth of the goddess, the earth goddess, the goddess of the harvest, Demeter, and her relationship with her daughter Persephone, who is abducted by the underworld god Hades and brought into the chthonic depths come fall and into winter, but then reunites with her mother Demeter above ground come spring, and especially in the summer harvest. And so again, keeping in mind this polar relationship of soul and world in the mythic structure of consciousness, we can gain a deeper sense of the extent to which human souls in those times when the mythic structure was dominant were so deeply embedded and participating in the life cycle of the world around them. For a mythical man, the movement of his soul became visible in the reflection of dream and myth, and in this way he became aware of the actual movement of the world. If we are to discover something outside ourselves, we must first discover it inside ourselves. The prevailing identification of the soul with number and star in Plato's later works, which he derived from the Pythagorean school, is an indication of the nocturnal birth of the temporal consciousness that was at first in step with natural as well as cosmic time. The cyclic motion of inner forces which began to be represented in myth had a complementary and polar reciprocal relationship to the natural and cosmic forces outside man. The Platonic Pythagorean identification of number might seem strange to us today, but that just conveys the extent to which we're inclined to think of number and time as well abstractly. Whereas for Plato, who was on the cusp of the dominance of the mythic structure in culture and the dawn of the mental structure, this was entirely appropriate and reflected the more participatory form of consciousness, the more porous self. And what's really significant here is Gebser's making of a close tie between this gradual process of differentiation of human consciousness into human centers, extricating itself from the life of the world, and the celestial observation of periodicities, so the regular patterns that the planets weave throughout the sky. We're all familiar with the astrological tradition, which was identical with astronomy in the past, because the ancients looked upon these periodicities as a form of intelligence bodied forth by the sky, from which their own intelligence issued forth. There was something of a divine perfection associated with the regular periodicities of the celestial sphere, of the planets and the stars. And a gradual internalization of that has resulted in what we call the mind, which we may, in the West, especially associate with the birth of philosophy in Plato, or the Platonic dialogues. And indeed, through the mind, his lucid mind, Plato offers us a beautiful distillate of that temporistic experience of time in his dialogue, the Timaeus, when he says, "Time is the moving image of eternity." But as I said in the beginning of this video, the mythic structure of our consciousness has come to be eclipsed over the last 500 years thanks to the deployment of perspective through our technologies and the rise of what Gebser calls the mental structure, which promotes a kind of disengaged rather than a participatory relationship with the fabric, the weaving fabric of the world. As Gebser writes, "The temporicity of myth differs from the temporality of the mind. The temporistic movement of nature and the cosmos is unaware of the temporal phases of past, present, and future. It knows only the polar self-complementarity of coming and going, which completely pervades it at all times. It is devoid of directionality, whereas the past and the future, viewed from the present of any given person, are temporal directions. It is this directional character of time which underscores its mental nature, and therefore its constitutional difference from natural cosmic temporistic movement, which is mythical in nature." Implicit in this more directional character of time, The time of the mental structure of consciousness, as Gebser describes it, is a self which determines its future in relation to this direction of time. So the mental structure of consciousness carries with it a more differentiated, potentially also more alienated form of selfhood, a more buffered self, in Charles Taylor's words. Owen Barfield refers to this process as the withdrawal of participation. So the withdrawing of our participation in the life of the cosmos, which at once as well facilitates our individuation and our potential to, out of freedom, choose once again to bring our lives into continuity with the life of the world. For those who are already somewhat familiar with the calendar of the soul, or perhaps very familiar with it, you'll be aware that the calendar is directly tuned into these temporistic movements that we've been exploring through Gebser. And as such, the calendar, explicitly according to Steiner, is a means of renewing our participation in the pendulum swing of the world, the pendulum swing of the soul. But it's impossible to just go back from the emergence of the mental structure to a time totally dominated by the mythic structure of consciousness. So we bring with us the fruits that have come from the emergence of the mental structure, which includes this more differentiated experience of self, as well as the attendant appreciation for historical contingency, for historicity, and the awareness of development or evolution, the potential for novelty, in contrast to the more fatalistic cyclic round of the mythic structure. So through this contemplative practice of the calendar of the soul, meditating on the verses week by week, we begin to reweave our souls with the soul of the world by attuning ourselves to the way in which polarity is weaving itself in our local environs. We begin to put the world garment back on, returning to a more planiform experience by weaving ourselves into the dynamism of the world, the polarity at work in the world. And so in contemplatively engaging with the calendar of the soul, meditating on the verses each week, we begin to reattune to the pendulum swing in our being that does not move in the element of time. And in doing so, we begin to put the world garment back on and to experience our bodies and our souls as continuous with the world body, the world soul. Gradually, as we participate once more in these rhythms, the immense alien vastness of the cosmos as it is understood by the contemporary scientific materialistic imaginary doesn't begin to shrink necessarily, but becomes a part of us once more, and so doesn't seem so alien and far away, but all inwardly related, as someone like David Bohm might contend. And so we have the potential to experience this for ourselves, to experience ourselves once more as microcosm, a cosmos in miniature. And importantly, what we bring to this renewal of our participation in the temporistic time of the mythic structure is this achievement of individual selfhood, as well as this sense for progressive development or evolution. In each of her commentaries on the verses of the calendar of the soul, Eloise Krivoshia writes, "Through meditating the calendar, we reach potentially a higher level of consciousness each year." And so finally, through this mention of the potential for individuals to reach higher levels of consciousness each year through the contemplative engagement with the calendar of the soul, we arrive at the greatest potential of this practice, which is for our own self-transformation to serve the world. We live in a time of many interlocking crises, probably the most crucial of which is the threat to the biosphere itself, the ecological crisis. And our renewal of participation in the life of the whole can serve to guide us in how we might best attempt to remedy the situation, because it's not just going to be through technology that we fix the problem. In fact, it's that form of thinking that is the problem. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it.